Behind us is the home of Judge Horton. And the Scottsboro Boys case is a case that forces us to reckon with a series of complications and contradictions. The complications and contradictions that come from the fact that this trial happens in a country that is founded on a series of legal propositions. Our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence are effectively, as it was articulated by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., promissory notes. The promise of life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, the promise of the presumption of innocence, the promise that we are going to frame our society around the proposition that all men are created equal. Those promises are brought into conflict and contradiction in the highest degree during this case. Because rather than enjoying the presumption of innocence, these young men are challenged and tried under the presumption of their guilt. It's a complicated case that forces us to reckon with the complications and the unevenness of American history writ large. And at the center of that case, near the center of that case, these young men are at the center of that case, but near the center of that case is Judge Horton. Judge Horton stands out as a historical complication because Judge Horton's father, as I recently learned, owned slaves. Judge Horton's father is a part of the historical complication that undergirds our understanding of American history at large. Judge Horton had grown up in a comfortable and privileged life, had enjoyed academic success, and was enjoying political success. Had gone to Vanderbilt, began his career as a medical student before ultimately falling in love with the law. I find a great sense of connection with him because so many pastors I've met are frustrated attorneys. He's enjoying an incredibly popular political career, and political commentators of the day are confident that Judge Horton has the legal acumen, the personality, and the political appeal to eventually be governor. But something happens to Judge Horton. When he comes to an understanding of this case, something happens within Judge Horton that will ultimately cost him all of the political capital that he had gained, all of the privilege that had been reinforced over the course of his life, all of the things that people looked at and saw in him during the day as being desirable would ultimately be leveraged and lost before this case was over. James Horton, Judge Horton, not uncomplicated, not an uncomplicated figure, not from an uncomplicated context, but he makes the decision to try this case. He makes the decision to preside over this case, and in so doing, risk and ultimately loses the popularity, the political career, and the privilege that had characterized his life up until this point. When Judge Horton chooses to involve himself in this case, this beautiful and stately home that stands behind me now begins its series of moves. And I would that we could reflect on the image of this home that stands behind me having to move. The first move that this home makes is from Athens, Alabama, where Judge Horton initially lived, but became a social pariah and outcast when he chose to involve himself in this case. Judge Horton, before involving himself in this case, is at the upper echelons of society in Athens. He's a judge. He's a respected legal mind, has a political career that is brimming with promise. But when he chooses to involve himself in this case, the people who had previously been his friends, his colleagues, and his neighbors ostracized him to the degree that Judge Horton labeled the planks in this home, took it apart, and moved it to Greenbrier, Alabama. The house that stands behind me is more than a home. It is a metaphor for the cost, the great cost, the risk, the great risk, the challenge, the great challenge that we must undertake and be willing to undertake, the loss, the great loss that we must be willing to suffer if we are going to make the sacrifices necessary to make our world, our communities, and our cities more just. This house moves from Athens to Greenbrier because of the ostracism that Judge Horton faces. And in moving this home, Judge Horton is beginning to move his life from the center of public popularity and political popularity to the margin. But he is endeavoring to move the possibility and the horizon of possibility from the margin to the center for people who had become grist for the mill of a justice system that in reality was an injustice system. This house moves from Athens to Greenbrier, and recently it moved from Greenbrier to Decatur to commemorate Judge Horton's place in the history of this city, in the history of civil rights in this city, and the sacrifices that good people had to make to stand up against the system. Not uncomplicated people, but people who sought to be good, people who sought to make the community more just, the state more just, history more just, and their relationships with the world around them more just. Behind me stands the second home on our tour today. Do we have any questions?
When you say that he chose to involve himself, I mean, he wasn't assigned the case?
Certainly. He makes the decision to preside on appeal. As he studies the facts of the case, his understanding, his medical understanding is brought to bear. He begins to realize that there's a limited, if not absent amount of physical evidence that would credibly prove that the young men who are accused of what they are accused of actually did it, right? The case is a kind of foregone conclusion until it goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ultimately determines that the constitutional rights of the Scottsboro Boys had been violated, okay? But Judge Horton, in his willingness to sort of involve himself in the orientation that he brings to the case, that's what costs him everything, right?
He could have chosen to run away.
Sure. He could have chosen to shirk responsibility. He could have chosen to retry the case when it comes back down from the Supreme Court, but to do it with a less critical gaze, right? He could have chosen to be a revolving door and said, okay, right, federalism, we've got to retry it again, but I'm going to rubber stamp it, right? But he doesn't do that. And in choosing not to do that, he ultimately risks and is willing to lose all that he had, all that he amassed. You're talking about someone who could have been governor, but was willing to leverage privilege and everything that he had spent his whole life gaining to be on the side of justice.